Hi everyone, my name is Claire Holliss. I'm a history teacher and I'm also one of the authors of the A New Focus on British Social History textbook from Hodder. And when I was helping to write the textbook, I focused particularly on the sections dealing with LGBTQ+ history. So in my last video, I discussed how one of the making history sections of the textbook could be used to get your students thinking about how historians find evidence of the lives of the LGBTQ+ community, how that evidence can be used, and how the archives that historians use might sometimes shape the kinds of stories that they tell. In this video, I'm going to discuss these themes further and also bring in some questions about how we describe people in the past that you might want to discuss with your students. And I'm going to do that by looking at another of the making history sections in this textbook. So this section, which I'm going to show to you now, deals with the question, why is it hard to find some people in historical sources? Now, as with the last video, I've got the Kindle version of the textbook up in front on my screen here. If you have a printed copy with you, you'll see this is on a double page spread. So on this double page spread, there is some discussion about why certain groups might not have details of their lives recorded and who therefore might be less visible to historians. So one of the examples given here is the failure to record ethnicity in censuses before 1990s. The question I'm going to explore, however, in more detail, is one that I think is really crucial in getting students to think about some of the challenges historians face when talking about the lives of people in the past, and also one that is particularly relevant to LGBTQ+ history. So this question focuses around the issue of when people do appear in the archives, how is it that they describe themselves, if and when they do? How do we understand those descriptions that these people give of themselves and their identities? And how does this then affect how we describe them? And I'm going to talk about how you might explore some of these questions with your students by looking at one particular document that is contained in this making history section. And this is an absolutely wonderful letter that was written by someone called Cyril to someone called Billy in 1934. I'm just going to bring it up now. There we go. So in this really fascinating letter, there's loads of amazing details that can tell you so much about Cyril's life, but also about the world in which he lived. One of the really interesting aspects about this letter is how Cyril describes himself and how he describes other people. And the word that he uses in this letter is the word queer. If you see here, he talks about how he has been queer since he came to London. He also describes the recipient of this letter, Billy, as queer as well, or potentially queer. Now, one of the really interesting questions you could open up with students when looking at this letter is what that word that Cyril's applying to himself actually means to him. Students could think about the ways in which Cyril just seems to associate this identity and the development of this identity with coming to London. This is saying it's something that seems to have emerged since he came to the city 2 years ago. They might also consider the different ways in which he describes his relationships with both men and women, who saying he still likes girls occasionally, that he's married with a child, but also he's then talking about a man that he lives with, and talking to Billy as well. It's also interesting to think about the some of the discomfort that Cyril expresses with his own identity and the identities of people around him, talking about being temperamental and dissatisfied. Putting this letter in its wider context and then taking these questions further, it's also really interesting to consider that we have this document which is obviously quite a private letter, because it was seized in a police raid on the Caravan Club in 1934. And you can kind of see hints of this sort of atmosphere at the end of the letter, where Cyril instructs or requests of Billy that he destroys this letter once it's been received. So you can see this phrase here, please be a dear boy and destroy this note, and do not mention it to anyone. This opens up a really interesting discussion. How does something as private as Cyril's identity and his personal relationships potentially being affected by the context of official persecution and the need for secrecy? Might this affect how Cyril describes himself? Finally, this letter can also be used to open up some questions that historians need to grapple with, particularly when talking about the lives of LGBTQ+ people in the past. Cyril uses a word here, queer, that many students might feel pretty familiar with. In fact, some of them might well use it to describe themselves. But does this mean something different to Cyril who's writing in 1934 than it does to a student sitting in a classroom in 2024? Discussing this with students can get them thinking about how we talk about people in the past. What are some of the problems with using words and ideas that we're familiar with to describe people who might have used same or similar words, but perhaps meant something different by them, who might have used completely different language, or who might not have tried to describe themselves at all. And they might also consider, as a historian who's trying to talk about the lives of people like Cyril, what's the case for using or avoiding using the kinds of language and the kinds of terminology that we're familiar with anyway. So, in these videos, I've given 2 examples of how you can use some of the making history sections alongside the rest of the material in LGBTQ+ history in the textbook, in order to tell some really interesting stories about the lives of people living in Britain in the 20th century. But I also hope it's given you some ideas about how you might use this book to get your students thinking about how history works as a discipline, and the particular issues the historians need to grapple with when they're trying to tell stories of a slightly wider range of people. Thank you very much for watching.